Charlotte Merrion did not weep the morning her uncle's man came for her mother's pearls. She unclasped them herself. She set them in his open palm, for safekeeping against the moths, he had said, and she thanked him for the trouble. That was me. I did not cry. 2 seasons later, at a county ball before some 40 guests, my uncle told the man who meant to marry me that my portion was encumbered. Those were his words. "You'd do better elsewhere," he said, and smiled while he said it. My engagement died at the refreshment table, somewhere between the lemon ices and the punch. That winter I stopped asking my uncle for anything at all. I went instead to a narrow office above the corn exchange in our little market town. I climbed the stairs. And I asked a very different sort of question. If you have ever been treated as invisible by your own family, this story is for you. Before I take you into it, do one small thing for me. Subscribe and stay to the end, because the end is the whole reason I am telling you any of this. And leave a comment with the town you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let me start where it truly starts. Not with the theft, with my father. My father was a cloth merchant in Marleigh, a market town in Gloucestershire that you will not find on any grand map. It had a corn exchange, a coaching inn, a church with a crooked spire, and a high street that smelled of horses and wet wool. My father's warehouse stood at the bottom of it, bolts of broadcloth and worsted, kerseymere and fustian stacked to the rafters. I grew up in the smell of dye and lamp oil. I thought it was the smell of the whole world. He was a careful man. That is the word I would use above any other. Careful. He measured twice and cut once, in cloth and in life both. He did not gamble. He did not boast. He kept his accounts in a great brass-cornered ledger that lived on a slope-topped desk by the counting-house window, and he wrote in it every evening by the light of a single candle in a small, upright hand. And here is the thing you must understand about me, because everything that comes later hangs upon it. When I was a girl, no more than 9, my father set me on a high stool beside that desk and taught me to keep his daybook. Not as a game, as a duty. He said a merchant's daughter who could not read a column of figures was a lamb in a field of wolves. He taught me to carry a sum in my head. He taught me to spot the entry that did not belong. He taught me that numbers do not lie, though the men who write them very often do. I loved it. I loved the neat ruled lines and the quiet of the work. My mother would laugh and say I had ink for blood. She said it kindly. She was a soft, warm woman who wore a rope of pearls at her throat on Sundays and let me play with the clasp when I was small. Those pearls were the only fine thing she owned. When she died of a fever, in the spring I turned 17, my father took the pearls and locked them away. For your wedding day, he told me, your mother would want them at your throat. So there was the shape of my whole early life. A careful father, a warehouse full of honest cloth, a ledger I could read as well as any grown clerk, and a rope of pearls waiting in a drawer for a wedding that everyone assumed would come. My father died when I was 20, not slowly, a chill on the chest that turned to something worse inside a fortnight, and then he was gone. And the warehouse smelled the same, and the world was entirely changed. He left me everything he had built, and he had built more than the town ever guessed. When the solicitor read the will, in the front parlour with the curtains drawn, the figure was spoken plainly, and I will speak it to you just as plainly now. £40,000. Held in trust until I married or came of full age. £40,000, and the pearls that were my mother's. £40,000. Say it to yourself, and let it sit. In our town, in those years, a labouring family lived on £40 a year and thought themselves not poor. A prosperous farmer might clear 200. My father, quiet, careful man that he was, had turned cloth into a fortune that could have kept 20 households in comfort for a lifetime. and all of it was mine. But I was 20, and I was a woman, and the law of that time did not think a woman fit to hold her own fortune. So my father's will did what such wills always did. It named a guardian, a trustee, a man to hold the money and manage it and hand it over whole and clean on the day I married or turned 25. My father, careful in all things, had named his own brother. His brother was my uncle Silas. I want to be fair to the memory of the moment, because at the time I did not fear him. I had no cause to. Silas Merrion was my father's elder brother, and I had known him all my life as a large, loud, comfortable presence at Christmas and at christenings. He had a fine house, Merrion House, on the good side of Marleigh, with a gravel drive and a lawn. He kept a carriage. He sat at the best card tables in the county and dined with men who had land. Where my father had been quiet, Silas was hearty. Where my father counted, Silas spent. As a girl I thought him grand. I thought his laugh filled a room like sunlight. I know better now. I know that the fine house was mortgaged to its chimney pots. I know that the carriage was not paid for. I know that a man who sits at the best card tables in the county and cannot afford to lose is not a grand man at all. He is a drowning one, holding your head under to keep his own above the water. But I did not know it then. Then I moved into Merrion House, a grateful orphan, and I called him Uncle, and I believed my father had chosen wisely. The first year, I will grant, was kind enough. My cousin Gerald was there, Silas's only son, a year or two older than me, and handsome in the way that costs nothing and earns nothing. Gerald was the golden child of that house. Whatever Gerald wanted, Gerald was given. A new horse, a new coat cut in the London fashion, a season in Cheltenham with money in his pocket. I watched it and thought little of it. A son is indulged. That is the way of families. And there was one bright thread through that year, and his name was Edmund Carraway. Edmund was the second son of a landed family a few miles out of Marleigh. Not rich himself, being a second son, but well-bred, well-liked, and gentle in a way I had not met before in a young man. He read books. He listened when a woman spoke, actually listened, with his head tilted, as though what I said might matter. We met at a subscription concert in the Assembly rooms. We met again, not by accident, at 3 more. By the spring I was 21. It was understood between us, in the way these things are understood before they are ever spoken. He would speak to my uncle would give his blessing, and the pearls would come out of the drawer at last. I was happy. I want you to see me happy. Just for a moment. Before the rest. A young woman of 21, numerate and not unhandsome, with £40,000 in trust, and a good man half promised, and her dead mother's pearls waiting for the day. I had every reason on earth to think my life would be a gentle one. It was in the autumn that my uncle's man came for the pearls. I remember it was a Tuesday. I remember the light was thin and grey through the landing window. Silas kept a manservant, a narrow, silent fellow named Pratt, who did the small, ungentlemanly errands that a gentleman does not do himself. Pratt came to my room, which was a small room at the back of the house, and he stood in the doorway and would not come in, and he said that Mr. Merrion wished to have the pearls taken to the strong room in town for safekeeping. Against the moths, he said, and against thieves. Now I was not a fool even then. I knew that pearls do not fear moths, but I was young, and I was a guest in that house, and I had been raised to be dutiful above all things. My father's careful daughter did not make a scene over a rope of pearls. So I went to the drawer, and I took out the case, and I opened it, and I looked at them one last time, though I did not know then that it was the last time, and I unclasped the case and lifted them out, and I set them in Pratt's flat, waiting hand myself. That is the part I hold on to. I did not let him take them. I gave them. I set them in his palm with my own fingers, and I said, Thank you for the trouble. There was only one witness. The housemaid, Annie, a good-hearted country girl, stood folding linen on the landing, and she saw it, and she said nothing, because what was there for a housemaid to say? The pearls went out of the house that Tuesday, and they did not go to any strong room. They went to a pawnbroker 2 towns over, a man named Hislop, and Silas took the loan against them, and the loan went, I do not doubt, onto some card table in Cheltenham that same week. But I did not know that for years. For years I believed my mother's pearls were sleeping safe in an iron box in town. That was the first taste. It was so small, a rope of pearls gone for safekeeping. If I had been the sort of woman my uncle believed me to be, I would never have thought of it again. The second offence was smaller still, and quieter, and I was not even in the room. There was a solicitor in Marleigh, an old, dry, cautious man named Mr. Voss, who had done my father's legal work and now did my uncle's. Some months after the pearls, Silas had a temporary want, as he called such things, a debt that would not wait, and rather than sell something of his own, he went to Voss, and he had Voss draw up the papers to sign away a small holding of my portion. A parcel of it, not the whole. A slice to cover the want, with every intention, I am sure he told himself, of putting it back. I know how that meeting went, because Mr. Voss years later told me himself, and because it was so exactly like Silas that I could have written it blind. Voss, cautious old creature that he was, raised an objection. The trust, he said. The young lady's interest. Ought she not to be consulted, or at the least informed? And my uncle waved his soft, heavy hand and said the thing that I would build my whole life around, though I did not hear it for years. The girl need not be troubled with figures, he said. The girl need not be troubled with figures. And Voss, who knew better, who had sat in my father's counting-house and seen a 9-year-old girl carry a column of sums in her head, said nothing. He drew the papers, he witnessed the signature, and he swallowed his objection whole, and it sat in him like a stone for years, and one day that swallowed stone would be worth everything to me. But on that day, the girl was not troubled with figures. The girl was in the garden reading a letter from Edmund and thinking her life was a gentle one. Then came the assembly. I have told you already how it ended, because I put it in the very first breath of this story. But now you know the shape of me, you can feel it as I felt it. So let me set the room. The Marleigh Assembly was the great social evening of our little county autumn. It was held in the assembly rooms above the Corn Exchange, the same building, remember it, the very same building over which, on a different floor, a different sort of business was done. The long room was lit with candles that night, dozens of them, and the good families of the district were all there in their best. There was a small band, there were ices, and there was punch on a long table by the window, and there were, I would guess, some 40 people in that room. I have never had to guess very hard. I have counted those 40 faces many times since, in the dark before sleep. Edmund was there. It was to be the night. We both knew it. He had told me, in a low voice by the door, that he meant to speak to my uncle before the evening was out, to make the thing formal at last, so that we might be openly engaged before Christmas. I wore my best gown, a soft dove grey. I had no pearls to wear at my throat. I told myself it did not signify. I do not know precisely what passed between the two men, Edmund and my uncle, because I was not beside them when it began. I was across the room. I saw Edmund cross to Silas near the refreshment table. I saw him speak, upright and earnest, the way he did everything, and I saw my uncle's face, and I saw it do a thing I had not seen it do before. I saw it decide. Silas did not lower his voice. That is the cruelty of it that I have never been able to forgive. A man who wished merely to refuse a match could have drawn the young man aside into a window bay and said his no in private, and let a girl keep her dignity in a crowded room. My uncle did not do that. My uncle raised his voice, just enough that the nearest dozen people fell quiet to hear, and through them the whole room, the way silence spreads across water. My niece's portion, he said, is encumbered. He let the word hang. Encumbered. You are a sensible young man, Caraway, and I am fond of you, so I will be honest with you as your own father would be. There is less there than the town supposes. A good deal less. You'd do better elsewhere. I have wondered many times exactly what Silas meant to do in that moment. Whether he thought he was protecting his own secret, for if my marriage had gone forward, the trust would have been paid out, and paid out it could not be, because it was already half gone into his card debts. Whether it was simple malice, whether he even knew the difference himself, it does not matter. What matters is that he said it aloud, before 40 faces, and every one of those faces turned, first to him, and then, slowly, the way a field of flowers turns, to me. Edmund did not fight for me. I will not pretend he did. He was a gentle man, and gentle men are not always brave men, and he was standing in a public room being told by an elder that the woman he loved was a poor bargain. He flushed. He looked at the floor. He looked at me across all those faces, and there was real grief in it, I think, but there was also the beginning of retreat. He murmured something no one heard. And then he stepped back from the refreshment table, one small step, and it was the loudest thing I ever heard. My engagement died in that one step, between the lemon ices and the punch. I did not weep. I want you to know that I did not weep. Not there, not with 40 faces watching to see whether I would. I had unclasped the pearls myself. I had set them in the man's palm and said thank you. And now I did the same thing again, in a way. I lifted my chin. I turned to the woman nearest me, a Mrs. Cotterell, and I said something calm about the warmth of the room, and I asked whether she would care for an ice, and I fetched her one. My hand did not shake. I have been told since, by more than one person who was there, that it was the stillness of me that they remembered. Not tears. Stillness, they mistook it for composure. It was not composure. It was the sound of something being decided, very quietly, under all that stillness, the way my uncle's face had decided. But mine decided differently. Mine decided to find out. Because here is what that night did. It did not break me. It woke the part of me that had sat on a high stool at 9 years old and learned to spot the entry that did not belong. For the first time, I stopped asking why my portion was encumbered as a wronged girl asks it, uselessly, of the ceiling. I started asking it the way my father would have. As a question with an answer written down somewhere, in a column, in ink, by a man who thought no woman would ever read it. I went home to Merrion House that night, to my small room at the back, and I did not sleep, and in the morning I began to look. It took me the better part of that winter. My uncle was careless, but he was not a complete fool, and the papers I wanted were not left lying about. But I had 2 things he had entirely forgotten I possessed. I could read a ledger better than any clerk in the county. And I was invisible. The girl need not be troubled with figures. Because he believed that absolutely to the marrow, he never once thought to watch what the girl looked at. I got into the counting house at Merrion House on the afternoons when Silas was at his club and Gerald was at his races, and I found, at the back of a cupboard, a thing that stopped my breath, my father's ledger. The great brass-cornered ledger from the warehouse. Silas had taken it when he took everything else, and had it carried to his own house, I suppose because it was fine and he liked fine things, and had then forgotten it entirely because he could no more read it than fly. But I could read it. And better, I knew the hand that ruled it, and I knew the method, because the method was the one my father had drilled into me on a high stool by a window. So I did the thing my uncle believed no woman could do. I reconciled the trust. I laid out every scrap of paper I could gather, the original figure £40,000 clean and whole the day my father died. And then, entry by entry, transfer by transfer, I followed the money out of the trust and into the dark. And the deeper I went, the colder I grew, sitting there in the failing winter light with my father's ledger open before me and my father's method in my hands. It was not a temporary want. It was not a slice. It was not a small holding signed away against an intention to repay. My uncle had bled the trust white. He had done it slowly over 2 years so that no single theft would draw the eye, and he had done it thoroughly. The parcels of my portion had gone out one after another to cover losses at the card table. There was money owed to a club in Cheltenham. There was money owed to private men, gentlemen of the county who lent at interest to other gentlemen and said nothing, holding scraps of paper with my uncle's signature at the foot. There were promissory notes. I did not fully understand the word then, but I would come to know it better than my own name, scattered across half the county, each one a promise by Silas Merrion to pay a sum he did not have. I added it. I added it the way my father taught me, twice, carrying the sums in my head against the columns to be sure. And the 2 answers agreed, and I set down the pen, and I sat in the cold, and I understood. £40,000. All of it. Every penny of the fortune my careful father had turned out of honest cloth, gone, not encumbered, not diminished. Gone into gambling debt, and the pearls sold to a pawnbroker on top of it, and my engagement killed in a public room to keep the secret buried a little longer. The man the law had appointed to protect my fortune had been the one man on earth robbing it. My guardian was my thief. And he had told the whole county I was the poor one. I will not pretend to you that I was calm when I understood it. I was not. There was an hour, alone in that cold room, when the grief and the rage rose in me so high I could not breathe against it. My father's whole life, my mother's pearls, Edmund's step backward, my own thank you, set into Pratt's flat palm, all of it, so that a drowning man could keep his seat at a card table one more season. But I was my father's daughter, and when the hour passed, what was left, underneath the grief, was not despair. It was the cold, clean thing you get to when you have finished adding a column and you know the total is true. It was certainty. I knew, now, and knowing is a kind of power that a wronged girl weeping at the ceiling never has. I did not yet know what I would do with it, but I knew where to take it, because there was one man left alive in Marleigh who had loved my father, and who could read a ledger as well as I could, and who had spent his whole quiet life in the business of money owed and money paid. His name was Josiah Pell. Josiah Pell had been my father's confidential clerk years back, and then had gone into business for himself, and now, an old man of 60, he kept a narrow office up a narrow stair above the Corn Exchange, the very building of the Assembly. 1 floor for the county to dance in and be cruel in. Another floor up the back stair where the real business of the county was quietly done. Pell was what they called a bill broker. He dealt in paper, in debts and notes and discounts, in the buying and the selling of what one man owed another. I had known him all my life as a kind, dry, careful old presence, and I had never once thought about what his work actually was. I went to him that winter with my father's ledger under my arm, wrapped in a shawl against the sleet. I climbed the narrow stair, and I asked him a very different sort of question than I had ever asked my uncle. I laid the ledger on his desk. I laid out what I had found. Every figure. He listened without a word, his old face still, and when I had finished, he sat a long moment looking at the columns, and then he looked at me, and there was something in his eyes I had not expected. It was not pity. I had had enough pity to last a lifetime. It was recognition. He was looking at my father's daughter, and he knew it. He said, "You have added this correctly." And then he said, "Your father would not be ashamed of this page, only of the man who made it necessary." Then I asked him the thing I had come to ask, though I hardly knew how to shape it. I asked him whether there was anything to be done, whether the law would give me my fortune back if I could prove the theft. And old Pell was quiet, and then he told me the truth, which was that the law, for a woman, was a slow and doubtful and public road, and that to drag my guardian through it might cost me years and my reputation and win me, in the end, a judgment against a man who had nothing left to give. You cannot squeeze £40,000, he said, out of an empty purse. I remember the cold that went through me at that even now, even knowing all of it, the law might leave me with nothing. And then Josiah Pell taught me the thing that changed my whole life. He did it casually. That is what I have never forgotten. He did not know, as he said it, that he was handing me a weapon. He was only an old broker explaining his trade to a bright girl to comfort her, the way you might explain the tides. He said, "You must understand what these are, Charlotte." He put his dry finger on the entries, on the notes, on the debts my uncle owed to the club and the private men. He said, "A debt is not only a burden to the man who owes it. A debt is property. It belongs to the man who holds the paper, and property may be bought, and property may be sold. That gentleman in Cheltenham who holds your uncle's note for £300, he would very likely sell it to me tomorrow for 200 in ready coin and count himself lucky to have the cash in hand rather than chase your uncle for years, and then the note would be mine. And I could hold it. Or I could call it in. At its full 300, and to the day." He took his finger off the ledger. He said, "Whoever holds the paper holds the man." I sat very still in that narrow office over the Corn Exchange in the sleet grey light, and I felt the whole world turn slowly on its hinge. Whoever holds the paper holds the man. My uncle had scattered his weakness across half the county in the form of little paper promises. He thought of them as his shame. Hidden, I saw, all at once, that they were not hidden at all. They were for sale, every one of them. And the man who bought them up would own not scraps of paper, but Silas Merrion himself, entire. I did not say all of that to Pell. I was learning already to keep my own counsel. But something must have shown in my face, because the old man watched me, and a slow, careful, almost fearful understanding came into his own. I asked him one more question that day, and I asked it very quietly. I asked how a person might buy such a note without the seller, or anyone else, knowing who had bought it. And Josiah Pell, my father's old clerk, looked at me for a long moment, and then, God bless him, he did not tell me it was no business for a woman. He did not tell me to leave it to the men or to the law or to God. He told me the truth of his trade. He said that a broker often buys on behalf of a client who wishes to stay hidden, and that the buying is done in the name of an agency, a screen, a name that means nothing and points to no one. He said there was no reason such a name might not be used to buy up the paper of one particular man, quietly, over time, so that the man himself never knew who was gathering him in. I said, "Then let us choose a name." We chose Aldegate. I do not remember now why. It meant nothing. That was the whole point of it. To Silas, in the months to come, the Aldegate agency would be no more than a jobber's name at the foot of a document, one of a dozen faceless concerns that dealt in paper. He would never once think to ask who stood behind it, because the girl need not be troubled with figures. I had almost no money of my own. That was the bitter joke of it. I was the heiress to £40,000, and I could scarcely have found 40 of my own to spend. But I had a little. A small independent sum my father had left outside the trust, in my own name, meant for pin money, that Silas in his carelessness had never troubled to steal because it was too small to notice. And I had one thing more, one thing I had not expected, that Pell, through his own quiet network, was able to recover for me. The pearls. My mother's pearls. Pell knew the pawnbroker Hislop, 2 towns over. He knew the trade, and he was able, discreetly, to redeem them, to buy them back out of pawn for the sum of the loan they had been left against. When he set the little worn case in my hands, and I opened it and saw them lying there against the faded silk, my mother's pearls, I very nearly broke at last. But I did not, because I had already decided what they were for. They were not for my throat. Not yet. I sold them, on my own terms, at their true worth, to a jeweller in Cheltenham who asked no questions, and I put the money with my small, independent sum. And with that little pool of coin, the pin money and the pearls, I bought the very first of my uncle's notes. It was a note for £140, owed by Silas Merrion to a wine merchant who had grown tired of asking. Pell bought it in the name of the Aldergate Agency for something under 100 in ready coin, and the wine merchant was glad to be rid of it, and the little paper came up the narrow stair and into a locked box in that office. And Josiah Pell handed me my father's brass-cornered ledger, and I turned to a clean page at the back, and in my father's small upright hand, the hand he had taught me on a high stool at 9 years old, I made the first entry. One note. £140. Held against Silas Merrion. It was nothing. Against 40,000, it was less than nothing, a single grain of sand. My uncle owed 100 times that and more, scattered across a whole county, and I had a girl's pin money and a dead woman's pearls to fight it with. Any sensible person would have called it hopeless. But I looked at that one clean entry in my father's hand, and I did not feel hopeless. I felt the way I used to feel at 9, when a column of figures was long and the light was going, but I knew that if I only kept at it, patient and careful, entry by entry, the sum at the bottom would come out true. I understood, sitting there, exactly what I had to do. Not weep, not beg the law, not shame my uncle in a public room the way he had shamed me, because a shout answers a shout and changes nothing. No, I had to become the one thing a man like Silas Merrion never thought to fear. I had to become his creditor. Quietly, patiently, note by note, name by cover name, over however many years it took, I would buy up every debt my uncle owed in all the world. I would gather him in, the whole of him, into one locked box up a narrow stair. And he would never know. He would go on laughing his sunlit laugh at the best card tables in the county and spending what was mine, and calling me the poor relation who need not be troubled with figures right up until the day I held every last scrap of his paper in one hand. And on that day I would do the one thing the title of my whole life had been promising from the start. I would call them all in. At once. I closed the ledger. I looked at old Josiah Pell, and I told him what I meant to do. All of it, and he did not laugh, and he did not tell me it could not be done, but his old face was grave, and he said one thing to me that I have never forgotten, and that I would think about many times in the long years that followed, when it very nearly came true. He said, "It can be done, Charlotte, but mind me. Your uncle is spending faster than you can buy. Every season he sinks a little deeper into new hands, new paper. You are gathering a man who is running. He is careless, so he will not see us, but if he sinks fast enough, he may be dragged to the bottom. And you dragged after him before ever your box is full." He leaned closer, in the grey light, over the locked box that held one small note and my whole future. "We must be faster than his ruin," he said. "And we are not, yet, so I did it. I did the thing that could not be taken back. That spring I sold what was left of my own small means. Not the trust. I could not touch the trust. It was a ruin. It was gone. I mean the little that was truly mine. The £40 a year my father had settled on me outside the guardianship, a widow's mite he had thought a girl might spend on ribbons. I did not spend it on ribbons. I gave it to Josiah Pell, coin by coin, and I sat down at the second desk in that narrow office above the Corn Exchange, and I learned his trade. I learned it the way I had once learned my father's daybook. at his elbow, getting it wrong, and being shown, and getting it right. Pell taught me how a bill of exchange travels, how a note is discounted, how a debt sours slowly, then all at once, and how the man who holds the sour paper is the only man in the room who is not afraid. I was 21 when I sold my pin money. I would be many years older before the box was full. I did not care. I had nowhere I would rather be. And all that while I dined at my uncle's table. That was the hardest part. Harder than the figures. I want you to understand it. Twice a month, sometimes more, I put on the plainest of my old gowns, and I walked up to Merrion House, and I sat at the foot of Silas Merrion's board, and I ate his food. His stolen food, bought with my money, and I thanked him for it. I thanked him for his care of me. I called him uncle in the warm, small voice of a girl who has given up. He liked that voice. He liked to hear it. He would carve the joint and look down the table at me and say to whoever sat near, "Charlotte does very well. She has learned to live small. It suits her," and the guests would nod and pity me and pass the potatoes. I let them. Pity is a fine coat to work under. No one watches the pitied. No one asks the poor relation what she does with her mornings. Here is what I did with my mornings. I bought him. Silas owed money in a dozen directions, and none of the men he owed loved him. That is the secret of a charming debtor. Everyone smiles at the table and grinds their teeth in the ledger. So when a quiet agency, the Aldersgate agency, a name that pointed nowhere, a name that was only me, offered to take a bad note off a tired creditor's hands for something under its face but ready coin today, the tired creditor took it. Of course he took it. A live shilling beats a dead pound. He signed the paper over. He was glad to be rid of it. He never asked who Aldersgate was. Why would he? A man does not question the hand that lifts a weight from him. The first note out of the wide world came to me in June. It was a wine merchant's bill, £17, 3 years stale. I carried it back up the narrow stair myself. I opened the locked box. There was already one note inside, the first, the one I had bought with the pearls. I laid the second beside it. Then I took out my father's brass-cornered ledger, the one I had found at the back of the cupboard, and in his old careful hand I had trained my hand to be like his. I entered the sum. And I drew the running line beneath, the line that would climb, if I lived, all the way back to £40,000. £17. Against 40,000. You will laugh. I did not laugh. I ruled the line, and I felt something in my chest go quiet and cold and steady, like a clock that has finally been wound. That was cycle 1, if you want to call the years by their turning, and cycle 1 nearly ended me before it was fairly begun. It was a night in autumn. I was at the table, the foot of the table being small. Silas had drunk well. He was leaning back telling a story against a man in Cheltenham, when he broke off and frowned at his own wine-glass and said, half to himself, in the idle way a full man speaks, "Who the devil is Aldersgate?" I did not move. I have thought since that not moving was the bravest thing I ever did. My hands lay in my lap. My face did the small tired smile it had learned. Inside I was a struck bell. "Aldersgate," he said again, tasting it. "Fellow keeps turning up. Bought Harkness's bill off him. Bought that wine thing. My paper keeps walking into this Aldersgate's pocket, and I never signed a line to any Aldersgate in my life." He looked round the table, genially baffled, a man mildly amused at a small mystery. "Who is he?" Gerald, my cousin, lounging as he always lounged, did not even lift his head from his plate. "A jobber, father," he said. "Some Cheltenham jobber, buying cheap paper to squeeze. They're thick as fleas. Ignore him. He'll want a shilling in the pound and go away." And Silas laughed, and was satisfied, and reached for the decanter. "A jobber," he said. "Well, let him hold my washing. He'll wait a long while for his shilling." And the table laughed with him, and the moment closed over my head like water, and I breathed again. A jobber. A Cheltenham jobber. My cousin Gerald had, without knowing it, given me the perfect suit of clothes to wear. From that night the Aldersgate agency was a greedy little jobber beneath a gentleman's notice, and no one in that house ever asked the question again. They had answered it. There is nothing so safe as a man who thinks he already knows. I went home and I entered the wine merchant's note in full, and under it I wrote 3 words that were not figures. A jobber, then, and I confess I smiled at the ledger, alone, in the cold. Cycle 2 was Cheltenham itself. The Card Club. That was where the deepest rot lay. There was a private club above a coffee house, a discreet address, green baize and good brandy, and men who lost more in a night than a labouring family saw in 10 years. Silas kept his best seat there. It was the seat that was killing him. The club did not lend as a friend lends. It kept books. It held signatures. And when I understood, from Pell, that the club would sell its worst names to be rid of the nuisance of chasing them, I went after the whole file. It took the better part of a year and near all my growing capital. Pell went down in person, the respectable bill broker, and dealt for the Aldersgate interest, and the club was glad enough. A gentleman's card debt is a hard thing to collect at law without scandal to the club itself. Ready money, no questions, a discreet broker to carry the parcel away. They sold me my uncle's ruin by candlelight and thought themselves clever. And in that parcel, folded in among Silas's own scrawled IOUs, I found the thing I had not dared hope for. Gerald's hand. My cousin, the golden child, had co-signed. Not once. Many times, vouching for his father's paper the way a careless heir vouches for anything, with a flourish and no thought. Certain the whole world would always come right for a Merrion. He had put his name under his father's name, joint and several, on debt after debt. He never read what he signed. Contempt makes a man careless with his signature. He thought signatures were for lesser men to worry over. Well, I worried over them. I read every one. I entered them all. The line in my father's ledger climbed that year like a tide coming in. Hundreds, then more than 1,000. I stopped being able to carry the box under one arm. Pell had a larger one made, iron-strapped, and we moved the papers into it, and the small first box we kept empty on the shelf. For sentiment. The running total stood, one grey afternoon, above £3,000 of Silas Merrion's debt, all resting in one silent hand, and my uncle at that moment was ordering a new carriage. Cycle 3 I did for my mother. The pearls, you remember, had gone to a pawnbroker 2 towns over. A man named Hislop. Silas had never redeemed them. A man who steals 40,000 does not trouble to buy back a rope of pearls. And I think he had half forgotten they existed. But I had not forgotten. Pell knew Hislop of old. And so one wet morning Pell walked into that dim shop and redeemed my mother's pearls with my money, and carried them out in his coat, and brought them up the narrow stair, and laid them on the desk in front of me without a word. I had not touched them since the morning I unclasped them from my own neck and set them in my uncle's man's palm. I picked them up. They were cold, and then they were warm, because I held them a long time. I did not weep. I had promised myself that first morning that I would not weep, and I had kept it through worse than this. But I held my mother's pearls in that grey office above the Corn Exchange, and I made them a promise instead. I would wear them once. Only once. On the day I called it all in. And then they would go in a drawer, and stay there, mine, never to be handed to any man's palm again. I put them away. I went back to the file. There was so much still to buy, and Pell, watching me, said the thing that was always under his kindness, the fear he carried for us both. "You are gaining on him, Charlotte," he said, "but he is sinking on his own account, faster this year than last. Mind the day his fall arrives before your file is closed. If he goes to smash with one note still loose in another man's hand, that man can drag him down in the common ruin, and you with him, and the whole of it lost. He looked at the iron box. We are faster than we were, he said. We are not yet faster than his ruin. He was right. God help me, he was nearly right to the letter. Because that was the winter Silas did the two things that almost beat me. First, he mortgaged the last field. There was one unentailed acre left, a good water meadow that had been my grandmother's, the last clean thing the family owned that no creditor yet had a claim on. He borrowed against it to a hard man to clear a debt that had finally grown teeth. That I could have borne. A mortgage is only more paper, and paper I can buy. It was the second thing. He came to me himself to tell me. That should have warned me. Silas never came to me. He had me up to the house on a bitter Tuesday, and he was all warmth, all uncle. And he sat me down by his own fire and told me my fortune was made. Charlotte, my dear, he said, I have been thinking of your future. A woman alone, it troubles me. It has always troubled me, and I have found the answer. He beamed. Colonel Rook has done you the honour of an offer. A settled man, a man of property. Older, yes, but that steadies a house. I have accepted him on your behalf. You'll be married from here in the spring. There, he spread his hands, generous, delighted with himself. Your poor uncle has provided for you after all. I sat very still by his fire. I knew Colonel Rook. I knew him from the file. Rook was the hard man who held the mortgage on the water meadow. Rook was a creditor Silas could not pay. And Silas, unable to pay him in money, had offered to pay him in me. My marriage was to cancel a debt. I was to be handed across a card table one more time, the way the pearls had been handed across a palm, quietly, for safekeeping, against a want. She'll do as she's told, I heard him say to Rook's man, later, in the passage, not knowing I was near. The girl has no more spirit than a wet Sunday. She'll do as she's told. That was the night I stopped being patient. I had meant to wait until the file was perfect, every last note. I had told myself patience must be total or it is nothing. It was my one blindness, and it nearly cost me the end of the whole game, because a spring wedding gave me only weeks, and there was still one note loose in the world. A single promissory note, £140, the very first sort of debt Silas ever signed, held now by a careful old attorney at Marleigh who did not want to sell. I went to Pell in the dark of the same night. I told him. I did not keep my voice small. I cannot wait for perfect, I said. He means to sell me by spring. I will not be sold twice. Get me the last note. Whatever it costs. Tonight, tomorrow, this week, but get it, and then I close the box, and then I call them in. Pell looked at me a long moment in the light of the one candle, and I think that was the moment the fear left his old face, because the thing he had feared was that I would wait too long, and here I was, refusing to. Then we stop buying quietly, he said, and we buy fast. It will cost you double, showing your hunger. Do you care? No, I said. Buy it. He bought it. It took him 9 days and near twice what the note was worth, and the careful old attorney was glad, in the end, of such a foolish, generous offer from a Cheltenham jobber. On the 9th night, Pell laid the last note in the iron box with his own hand, and I ruled the last line under it in my father's ledger. And I carried the running total down to the foot of the page. I will not pretend to you it came to 40,000 exactly. Debt bought at a discount never does. But every debt my uncle owed in all the world now lay in that box, joint and several, his son's name folded through it, the mortgage, the card club, the wine merchant, the whole long tale of his ruin, and against it. Restored on paper to the penny, stood the trust he had emptied, £40,000. His to pay, mine to call. I closed the box. I looked at Pell. Now, I said, all of it. At once. We sent the notices the next morning to every creditor who had ever sold me paper, a line to say the Aldergate interest now held the entire body of Silas Merrion's debt in one hand, and their business was settled, and to Colonel Rook a separate line that he would learn the rest of shortly, and to Silas, to my uncle, a single sheet in a clerk's plain hand, requesting the honour of his presence at Merrion House on the Thursday morning to discuss the settlement of certain obligations at the convenience of the holder. He did not know the holder was me. He thought it was the jobber. He came expecting to squeeze a shilling out of a nuisance and to announce over it my wedding. He told Gerald to be there to see the sport. He asked Mr. Voss, the family solicitor, to attend and lend the thing weight. He set the stage himself in the very drawing-room where the family had gathered so often to pity me, and he never guessed he was building his own scaffold. I wore grey, and at my throat, cool against the skin, I wore my mother's pearls. They were all there when I came down. Silas in his best chair by the fire, expansive, a man about to enjoy himself. Gerald sprawled on the sofa, bored already, turning his hat. Mr. Voss stiff by the wall with his papers. The silent solicitor who had watched the first small robbery years ago and swallowed his objection and said nothing. And by the far window, quiet, unremarked, a plain old man in a plain coat whom none of them thought to notice. Josiah Pell. Silas looked up when I came in. For half a second he did not understand why I was there, in that room, at that hour. Then he settled it in his own mind, the niece, come to be told of her wedding, how fitting, and he smiled his sunlit smile. Charlotte. Good. Sit. My dear, this won't take a moment. We've a tiresome bit of business, and then I've news for you that'll. The tiresome bit of business is mine, uncle, I said. I am the holder. I laid my father's brass-cornered ledger on the table, and on it, from the bag I carried, I set down the notes, all of them. The whole file, iron-strapped no longer, spread in a fan across the wood, his hand and his son's hand, 40 faces of his ruin, more paper than one man could gather up in his 2 arms. The room went very quiet. You did not come here today as my uncle, I said. I did not raise my voice. I had learned, from years at the foot of his table, exactly how quiet a thing can be and still be heard in every corner of a room. You came as my debtor. Every last one of them. Held in this hand. Silas laughed. I had known he would. It was his one weapon, and he reached for it. He laughed the warm, easy laugh that had carried him across 20 years of card tables and dinners and small thefts, and he spread his hands, and he appealed to the room. Aldergate, he said, delighted you, a woman. My little niece has been playing at broker. He shook his head as though I had done something charming. Charlotte, you cannot read a ledger, my dear, whatever you've been told up some back stair. This is men's. This is grave business. Voss, explain to the child that a trustee is entitled to borrow against the estate for. Read them, I said. For temporary wants it is perfectly regular. Any trustee may. Read your own name, uncle, 40 times over. And then tell Mr. Voss it was borrowing. And he stopped laughing, because he had picked up the first note to wave it away, and he had seen his own signature. And under it the next, and the next. I watched it go out of him. I watched the sunlit certainty drain down through his face like water going out of a cracked jug. He turned the notes over. He turned them over faster. Card Club, Wine Merchant, Rook's Mortgage. His hands began, just slightly, to shake. This is, he said. These are private, how did you? He looked up. And for the first time in my life my uncle looked at me as at a person, and what was in his face was fear. Voss, he said, and it came out cracked. Voss, tell her. Tell her a trustee may borrow, Mr. Voss cleared his throat. He had been silent for years. He had swallowed his objection at that first fraudulent withdrawal and looked at his shoes and said nothing, and I had noted it, and I had made sure he was in this room. Now, with the ledger open in front of him and the whole county's worth of his client's ruin fanned across the table, the old solicitor found, at last, that he had a voice. "It was not borrowing, Mr. Merrion," Voss said quietly. "I have seen the accounts this morning, before I came. The trust is not encumbered. The trust is empty. There is a difference, and the law knows it, and I am too old to pretend I do not." He would not meet Silas's eyes. But he said it. £40,000 were held for Miss Merrion. They are gone. That is not a want. That is a wrong. I opened my father's ledger to the page I had kept for this. One column, his ruin, totted to the foot. Beside it, the other column, the trust as it should have stood, restored to the penny. £40,000. I turned it so Silas could see. His theft and my portion side by side, in my father's careful hand, balancing at last. "You spent my mother's dowry at the card table," I said. "You took her pearls off my neck for the moths and left them with a pawnbroker in the wet. You stood up at the Marleigh Assembly before 40 of your friends and killed my engagement with one sentence, to stop the trust being paid out and the theft being found. I know all of it. I have known it for years, and every year, while you called me the poor relation who need not be troubled with figures. I bought you, note by note, until there was nothing of you left in any other hand but this one." Then Gerald spoke, because Gerald had finally understood that this touched him. He had come off the sofa. He was leaning over the table, poring at the notes, and his handsome, bored face had gone the colour of tallow. "These are father's," he was saying. "These are father's debts. They're nothing to do with weight. He had found his own name. He had found the second, and the third. I only signed those to oblige him, I never. A co-signature isn't. Charlotte, that's not real. Tell her Voss. A man can't be held for putting his name to oblige his own father. Joint and several." "Miss Merrion," said Voss, tired, precise. "It is the plainest phrase in the law. You signed as principal, not as friend. Whatever your father cannot pay, Miss Merrion may recover from you, to the last shilling." Gerald sat down. He sat down where he stood, on the arm of the sofa, and stared at his own careless signature as though it had bitten him. The golden child, who had spent his whole life certain the world would come right for a Merrion, held in his hand the exact measure of what his contempt had cost him. He owed what he had thought he would inherit. I did not gloat. I had promised myself I would not gloat. A shout answers a shout, and I was done with shouting. I only said, one line, quietly, across the room, "You should have read what you signed. Cousin, my father taught me that at 9 years old. I'd have thought your father might have taught you. He had nothing to say to it. There was nothing to say. That left Rook. I had not asked Colonel Rook to the house. He was not family, and this was a family reckoning, but his claim was in the room, in the fan of paper, the mortgage on the water meadow, and the debt my marriage was meant to pay. So I took up that note, Rook's note, and I held it a moment, and then I tore it across, and across again, and let it fall. "You may tell the Colonel," I said, "to no one, to all of them, that the debt he was to be paid with a wife is discharged. I hold his mortgage now. I forgive it. He is quit, and I am quit, and there will be no wedding in the spring." I looked at my uncle. "You are going to pay a creditor with me, uncle, the way you paid the pawnbroker with my mother's pearls. But I am not currency. Not any more. He is paid in paper. We are quits." Silas made one last try. It was a small thing, and it was the truest thing he ever said to me, and I have never decided whether he meant it as surrender or as one final charm. "Charlotte." His voice had gone soft. The bluster was all out of him. He was an old man in a good chair, surrounded by his own ruin, and he spread his shaking hands and he said, "What do you want? Name it. Money? I'll find money. What do you want from me?" And I found that I knew the answer, and had known it for years, and that it was not money at all. "I want it said," I told him. "All of it. Not here, in this room where it's easy, before the county. The same faces that watched you break my engagement will watch you resign the guardianship and own what you did with my £40,000. You will make it good on paper. I hold the means to make you, and I will use them to the letter of the law, not 1 inch outside it. And you will step down before them all, and let it be known why. That is the price, not a penny for myself beyond what was always mine, only the truth, in public, in your own mouth." He looked at me, and then, because there was nothing else left to him, because I held every road he might have run down, my uncle bowed his head. That is how it ended, not with a shout, with a bowed head and an old solicitor's quiet voice and 40 faces of paper fanned across a table in a room that had once been used to pity me. The ledger did what the voice never could. It is a lesson I would give to anyone who has been made small by the people who were meant to keep them safe. Do not shout. Keep the books. The books outlast the shout. He resigned the guardianship at the Michaelmas sessions before the same county that had watched him ruin me, and the truth came out in his own tired mouth, as I had required. The restitution was made to the letter, my £40,000 restored, mine at last, the metre of my whole life paid back to the penny. And the law and the ledger between them saw it done, with never a raised hand or a raised voice from the first day to the last. Let me tell you where they all came to rest, and then I will let you go. It is a year on, now near enough. I am at my own table as I tell you this. A modest house in a quiet street in Marleigh, bought outright with money that is honestly mine, not the trust. I gave the trust to its proper purposes and kept my independence separate, the way my father would have wanted. The table is scrubbed deal, not fine. The teapot is chipped at the spout. The morning comes in through a clean window and lies across the wood, and my father's brass-cornered ledger sits on the shelf, balanced, closed, its work done. In a drawer upstairs, wrapped in soft cloth, are my mother's pearls. I wore them once, on the Thursday I called it all in. I have not worn them since. I keep them, I do not wear them. There is a difference, and I have earned the knowing of it. Silas rents 2 rooms now above a shop 2 towns over. It is Hislop's shop, the pawnbroker who took my mother's pearls in the wet. My uncle climbs those stairs every night past the very window where the pearls once hung waiting, and I do not think he has ever remarked the joke of it, but I remark it for him, gently, here, Gerald clerks for wages in Cheltenham. He reads what he signs now. They tell me he reads it very carefully, twice, moving his lips. It is the one useful thing his family ever gave him, and it came late, and it came hard, and I am told he is punctual. Mr. Voss, who was silent so long, speaks well of me now, to anyone who will listen. He tells the story in the coffee house as though he saw the justice of it from the start. I let him. An old man who finds his voice at the end is still a man who found it. I bear him no grudge for the years he kept it in his throat. And Edmund Carraway, the man who withdrew from me at the refreshment table before 40 guests when my portion became inconvenient, Edmund called on me last month. He had heard, of course. Everyone had heard. He came in his good coat, and he stood in my small parlour, and he apologised, handsomely and at length, and I understood that he had come to see whether the door might open again, now that I was worth the trouble. I poured him a cup of tea from the chipped pot. I listened to the whole of it. I did not interrupt, and I did not scold, and when he had finished I asked after his mother, and thanked him for the call, and did not ask him to stay. That was all. No shout. There was nothing there to shout at. He had shown me, years ago and at the worst hour, exactly what he was, and I had believed him then, and I saw no reason to unbelieve him now that it was fashionable to be believed. He went out into the street a little puzzled, I think, that grace could be so final. It can. It is the coldest warm thing in the world, and I poured it out for him to the last drop and kept the door shut all the same. So, that is the whole of it. What is taken by the hand that was meant to protect you is only ever borrowed, held for safekeeping, they will always say, against the moths. And a borrowed thing can be called in. Every debt, in the end, comes due to the one patient enough to hold it, and quiet enough that no one thinks to ask her name. I was that quiet, once, because they made me quiet. I am not quiet now. But I never had to raise my voice. I only had to keep the books. If you have watched this far, and if any of it found you where you live, then tell me one thing before you go. Comment the town you're watching from. I should like to see how far a quiet woman's story can travel.